I'd like to thank the PEM for inviting me to speak today. I was actually hoping to hear the first paper on politically connected companies before speaking, but since I've been asked to speak first, let me say this. The topic today is about government in business. And what I want to do today is problematize what do we mean when we say government in business? Who exactly are we talking about? So this is my sub-team, governments in business and intervention. My key point is institutions matter. I'd like to start by saying this. While in the 1990s, the key focus was on politically connected companies, there has been a sea change. And I'm going to argue today that the real focus that we should be concentrating on is on government-linked companies. But what exactly are government-linked companies? Now here is a diagram of what the government classified as GLICs, government-linked investment companies. I'm going to take you through history to show you the different kinds of GLCs. When we say GLCs, who exactly do we mean by GLCs? There are many types of different GLCs. This is the first category, government-linked investment companies. In the year 2005, Khazanah was instructed by Prime Minister Abdullah to revamp the major publicly listed companies and investment holding companies, and they came up with a document, the GLC transformation program. And the government decided at that point to classify 7 companies as GLCs. This is the government's classification. And they decided that these 7, Minister of Finance Incorporated, Khazanah, EPF, KWAP, PNB, Tabung Haji, and LTAT would be GLICs. This is important also because the 7 GLICs control a huge segment of the corporate sector. We did a book called Minister of Finance Incorporated, where we looked at just the top 100 companies controlled by these 7 companies, and we came up with this. The volume of companies, this doesn't mean they're all GLCs, but the volume of companies associated with just these 7 GLICs is just huge. When we went down 10 levels, we found that at least 68,000 companies are in some way associated with these 7 GLICs. That doesn't necessarily mean they're GLCs. There's a specific definition for that. We went further to study other forms of businesses owned by the government. And here, in a more recent study, we looked at the business of ministries. Do you know that the cabinet ministries own companies? And among the cabinet ministries, there are about 7 or 8 of them who are really have a large number of companies under their control. But 4 of them, we call them the big 4. 4 of them are really huge in terms of the number of GLCs that they own. So here I want to take you through some of the GLCs, just the big 4. This is the big 4. I'm not talking about all 20 GLs, all 20 ministries. Here are the big 4. And if you can see, it's probably too small for you to see it. In the legend, you can see in blue are the ministries. Then we have different types of GLCs, the GLICs. We have statutory bodies. We have foundations. We have holding companies. We have special purpose vehicles. They're all here. All these different types of companies are called GLCs. So when we say GLCs, who exactly are we talking about? So let me break it down further for you. This is just the Prime Minister's department. And here I'm just showing you what the so-called GLCs do. And they do different things. Most of these so-called GLCs do, first of all, social issues, Felda, Yayasan Equity National, Equity Amanah Raya. These are socially oriented GLCs. We even have religious-based GLCs. The Majlis Agama Islam Wilayah, we have the Tabung Haji, that's also under the Prime Minister's department. And then we have the economic-based GLCs. So here we have the Iskandar Regional Development Corporation, we have Prima, we have MPRC, we have MITE. The list is huge. And on the right, here you can see, when we look at them, they are statutory bodies. When we talk about institutions, who are these institutions? Some of them are statutory bodies, some of them are companies, some of them are foundations. So when, again, I'll say this, when we say we want to reform the GLCs, Who exactly are we talking about? Here I want to show you the Ministry of Finance. This is just Ministry of Finance. I'm putting this up because the Ministry of Finance is a very powerful ministry. All this is under Najib. This is not under Mahathir. This is not under the current government. And I'll come to that later, why this is all under Najib. When Mahathir took power, this MOF was also halved or carved out. PNB is now under the Prime Minister's Department. Khazanah is now under the Prime Minister's Department. They've been shifted around. There was a time when we said the Prime Minister cannot be Finance Minister. Fine. So when Mahathir became Prime Minister, since he can't be Finance Minister, he took PNB and Khazanah and put it under Prime Minister's Department. And he made himself the chairman of Khazanah. Yes, you may laugh. But do you all know that this is the current state of affairs? And when we say revamp of GLCs, again I come back. What are we talking about? What about Khazanah? What about PNB? Who should control it? Let me take you through now. Under the old days, under Najib, when we had MOF, we had Khazanah, PNB. Khazanah was a sovereign wealth fund. PNB, a GLIC, is also a unit trust management enterprise. Then we have Minister of Finance Incorporated, MOF Inc. That's a very covert holding company. We have EPF and KWAP. These are retirement funds. There's such diversity here. And they're all doing different things. And yet we call them GLCs. And then we have below that DFIs. DFIs are very important. Development Financial Institutions. We have Bank Pembangunan. We have Agro Bank. We have SME Bank. These are important institutions which play a role of enabling and developing SMEs, nurturing new industries. But they are also classified as GLCs. And we say we want to get rid of all these GLCs. And then we have also other institutions like LADA and Bank Negara, which also falls under this. Let me take you to another ministry. I put up this ministry, Ministry of Rural and Regional Development. Most of you all have not heard of or may not think it's very important. But let me tell you that this is one of the most important ministries in government. Under Najib's time or under UMNO's time, this ministry was always held by a senior UMNO leader. And if you look at this institution, you will find, why is it so important? Because they control MARA. You know, MARA is just so huge. RISDA, Keseda, Ketengah, they really reach down to the grassroots. And that's why it was so important for a senior UMNO member to control this ministry, because you control this ministry, you control the rural areas, which was UMNO's bastion of support. Today, do you know who's the Minister of Rural and Regional Development? Bersatu Serina Harun. Again, Bersatu now taking control, giving it to a person from that party. Unfortunately, such an important ministry. And why is it so important? Look at this table. Look at what this ministry does. Land development, RISDA, very important work. Regional development, Kejora, Kedah, Keseda. They go down to the grassroots. They help alleviate poverty, the important source of land development, productive land development. This is a crucial ministry to look after. And then look at the other point, land redistribution. And then we have MARA. And MARA plays a very important role in terms of education and also in terms of promoting entrepreneurship. But here, the key point about this ministry is most of the institutions that play a big role here are statutory bodies. These are socially oriented institutions. They are not companies. They are statutory bodies. They are classified as GLCs broadly. But look at the work they do. Their work is not business. Their work is about social issues, social development. And this is an important ministry because it is one ministry where you'll see a lot of statutory bodies. But I want to come back to this. These statutory bodies have gone on to develop a whole mess of GLCs. The statutory bodies are in yellow. In blue are GLCs. Why did they go and create so many companies? For what purpose did they do this? And do they need all these companies to do this social work? The reason behind this is because these GLCs function not as companies as such, but as tools of patronage. tools of political financing too. And here, I want to show you MOSTI. MOSTI is very important because it's the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, a very important ministry. And here you will see the first thing that hits you is, in MOSTI there are no statutory bodies, there are no SPVs, they are all companies. And look at what they do. The important work done by these include financing industries, R&D, technological development. These are very important roles that the government should play. This is a very important ministry. This was one ministry which was not controlled by any prominent politician. In fact, the politician the cabinet member who was in charge of this was someone from Sabah. Walter, I can't even remember his name, so insignificant is he. All the other ministries were controlled by UMNO. Today, there's no MOSTI. Today, it's called MASTEC. They've mixed environment and MOSTI together. When they called it MASTEC, I said, it's a mistake. It should be called mistake. You can't mix environment with MOSTI. Look at the work that MOSTI does. And MOSTI is important for industrialization, industrial development, technological development. Do we want to get rid of these companies? How do we make them more functional in terms of technological development? Now, having dealt with this, let me show you how complex the problem is. Because today, in fact, you heard Azmi saying federal-state relations. Yes, let's look at the states. The states also have GLCs. And here, when you look at the GLCs, look at the institutions that control them. You have, on one hand, economic-based institutions, you have investment arms, you have religious-based institutions again, then you have social-based institutions. And they have different types of institutions that own them, SEDCs, SADCs, the Social State Education Foundation. They all do important things. The most important was the SEDCs. The SEDCs, as you can see here from the tables, were set up in the late 1950s and 1960s. The SEDCs were directly linked to the federal government. The federal government was linked to the state governments through the SEDCs. Someone from the federal government, EPU, would sit on the board of directors of SEDC so that they could coordinate policies. There was a proper coordination policy going on. SEDCs did great work in the old days. And then something happened. They began to create CMIs. CMI is Chief Minister Incorporated. Now you see the shift from bureaucratic to politician. And if you look at the tables here, the objectives of the SEDCs and the CMI, they are very dissimilar. There's no control over the CMIs. And this morning you heard Tan Sri Herbert, he raised a very important question. What is the role of the politicians? And what is the role of the bureaucrats? Here, this table indicates the shift that he was alluding to. You can see it. And here's the point. Each of the 13 states function differently. And I'll take you through some of them. Selangor, controlled by PKR. And as you can see here, we have on one side the SEDCs, on the other side the CMI. In the middle is the Chief Minister, Azmin. Again, I'm giving you all post, pre-Mahathir, because it's all Najib's time. Look at the way they have evolved. On one hand, the CMI has its own network of companies. On the other hand, we have the SEDCs functioning simultaneously. The only person really coordinating this is the Chief Minister. And where's the oversight to the way in which these things are run? And here, let me take you, if you think it's PKR, let me take you to Penang, DAP. Do you know that CMI was set up by Lim Guan Eng 1 year after he came to power? There was no need, and you can see CMI is there on the left. In the middle, the most important institution, the Penang Development Corporation. And at one point, they developed the State Secretariat Institution, which was also supposed to play the role of moderating all this. But now we have 3 different institutions. And if you can see in the brackets, in the triangles, what I'm showing you here are basically politicians who are appointed as directors of these companies. Penang is doing the same thing. And here is Johor. Johor is even more complex. Johor, we have Johor Corp, which used to be the SEDC, which was a well-functioning SEDC, created some vibrant companies, including KPJ hospitals, a vibrant sector. And then on the other hand, now you have KPRJ, which is under the chief minister. And on the other hand, you have other types of companies also, which are running, which are controlled by powerful people. This is a very complex state structure. Now I'm showing you this to show you how different administration is of GLCs and the different institutions that are being used to control the GLCs in the different states. There's no one common frame, one common picture going through here. And to end it all off, I should show you Kelantan Pass. If Johor was UMNO, this is Kelantan. In Kelantan, there's no method to all this, what's the word, madness that we see before us. Just a slew of GLCs being created and a huge number of politicians appointed into these GLCs. What does this say? And this is, now I come to my concluding remarks. The issues that we debate, that we have to debate. When we say state intervention is important, and I agree state intervention is important, I have shown you all some examples of some very important firms. How should the state intervene? What institutions should it use when it intervenes? So the key points about institutions. We have seen there's a diverse range of methods of intervention, which are the progressive forms of intervention. And I've spoken of some of the more progressive forms. What about institutions like GLICs? DFIs are very important. Statutory bodies are very important. SEDCs are very important. But they are not companies. They are not companies. They play a different role. And I would argue we need to keep them. I would also argue that we don't need institutions like the CMI or MOF Incorporated, unnecessarily giving too much power to politicians to do things which are diametrically different from what the SEDCs are doing. What about key institutions, socially oriented institutions, the Ministry of Rural and Regional Development? Should we not keep that ministry and keep those statutory bodies? But should we not also close down many of these useless GLCs? Those are the changes that I'm talking about that we need to debate. And should we not support important new sectors? Shouldn't we go into risky, technologically based industries? Who is going to finance this R&D? Today we are here to talk about Malaysia Incorporated 2.0. I support that. But how do we do it? With this structure, without any change? This will be disastrous if we carry on with this structure. So the key question now, my last key question is about managing GLCs. Should business-based enterprises do social work? They seem to be doing everything, as you can see here. Should politicians who rule be allowed direct say in the managing of these GLCs and how its resources are being used? We have seen how they become tools for patronage and political financing. And how do we appoint these professionals? What is the relationship between the professionals who run these companies and how are they accountable to government? These are important questions that we have to ask ourselves. I can now tell you this. From the time the new government came to power, we have been advocating, we meaning me, and a few people in the NGO circles. But I've taken the lead, I'll say, I have taken the lead on this. With a few NGOs, we have gone and we have spoken to ministers, let's change this. I've met the CEP and I said, we need to look at the GLC structure. We need to revamp this so that we can get this to function properly. I can tell you we have met different state government leaders and we have spoken to them about it. And I can tell you this, there's no political will on the part of the government, even today's government, to deal with this. The structure today is well suited for them to use this as a basis for the consolidation of political support. And if that is going to be the primary basis of why they want to keep the structure, then do not expect this GLC structure to function well. What is important is for the politicians to be told that we need to revamp the structure. There should be an arm's length relationship from politicians with this structure, and we have to use this structure progressively to nurture vibrant domestic enterprises, and to do the socially oriented work that they were supposed to do, not make them be tools of patronage to muster political support. Thank you.
Very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Wong Wayan, and I am a PhD candidate from University Science Malaysia in Penang. As you may have already know, I am presenting my paper today with the title Political Connection and Risk-Taking. Although the paper was actually written for academic purposes, but I believe that this topic is not too difficult to comprehend. However, if you have any clarification, I will be glad to answer them at the end of the session. I shall not waste any more time and will get going with my presentation. So let's start with the reason. Why political connection and risk-taking? There are three reasons that are stated in this paper on why we did this topic. First reason is, of course, from the academic point of view. As my background is in academia, it seems unavoidable that I will need to include some sort of novelty in my research in order to justify why I am doing this. However, there are also things like, as I go through literatures in this subject, there are a lot of academic papers which has highlighted the positive relationship between political connection and also better firm performance or better firm value. And there are a variety of reasons that was actually given by past researchers on why this happened. Among them include things like politically connected firms getting preferences in terms of government projects, in terms of getting cheaper loans, bailouts, and etc. However, in this paper, we try to argue from a slightly different perspective, which is from the perspective of risk-taking. We argue that politically connected firms can have or should have higher risk-taking because they have a special resources, which is political connection, which will then supposedly enable them to have higher performance. And if this is true, it would simply explain the results or partly explain the results on the higher performance of politically connected firms in the past literatures. However, whether this is true or not is still debate because but we will see them at the end of this presentation later when I presented the results. The second reason on why we did this topic is due to the importance of risk-taking. This is because risk-taking is an important factor that could possibly dictate the future growth of any country or any firm. Firms' willingness to undertake risk is also an important aspect for developing countries like Malaysia, not only for developed countries like the US. For example, big international firms that you see nowadays, like perhaps Facebook or Apple, got where they are today because of the risk that they took in inventing something new, which then they introduce it to the mass consumer. The third reason on why we are doing the relationship between political connection and risk-taking is also because of crisis. This is because the occurrence of crisis is sometimes precipitated by excessive risk-taking. And this is particularly obvious in the case of global financial crisis in 2008 and to a certain extent the Asian financial crisis in 1998, which we very much experienced it on our own. For example, in the global financial crisis in 2008, we see that due to the actions of certain companies in the US, like the Lehman Brothers, which took on too much risk, which then caused them to go bankrupt when they had to withstand the shock from the subprime mortgage crisis. And in terms of the Asian financial crisis in 1998, we see that at that time, some politically connected firms were too much over-leveraged, which then also caused them to be declared bankrupt, and some of them had to be bailed out by the government in the offset of the financial crisis. So we had three reasons on why we did this. Firstly, of course, is from the academic point of view. Second is because of the the importance of risk-taking, and thirdly is because of the excessive risk-taking, which would then cause crises such as global financial crisis to happen. Next, we move on to how does political connection affect risk-taking. Based on literatures, there are actually two ways, which is the direct method. In the direct method, it's simply governments or political connection affecting firms' operations, which in turn will affect its corporate risk-taking. In order to do so, governments will need to have a certain percentage of ownership in the firm. And this is particularly true for GLCs in Malaysia, because only when they have a substantial amount of ownership in the firm, they can alter the risk-taking propensity of the firm by directly commanding or asking the firms to perhaps increase their risk-taking or decrease their risk-taking, such as their investment in certain assets or R&D expenses. The second method is the indirect method. For the indirect method, is actually through more of through firm monitoring. When political connection have higher power or higher percentage of ownership in the firm, they can actually sort of modify the balance of power between the inside monitoring and also outside monitoring. So when they become stronger, it is actually it will cause the outside monitoring to become weaker, which will then alter the risk-taking propensity of the firms inside. So in the underlying theory, in developing the hypothesis and to explain the impact of political connection and risk-taking, there is an underlying theory which we very much depend on, and this theory is called the resource dependence theory. So in this theory, political connection is viewed as a type of resource. It is actually viewed as a type of valuable resource where it should benefit firms in terms of things like social capital, such as networking, background, the knowledge and know-how of government process to firms. However, like all things in the world, there are two sides of coin. Political connection can also be detrimental for firms' risk-taking when it pursues its own agenda. For example, most GLCs have negative effect on firms' risk-taking based on past literatures. Why does that happen? It is because most of the time GLCs have a higher social obligation as compared to their other types of politically connected firms, or even as compared to non-connected firms. Sometimes they may need to undertake some unprofitable projects, but those projects that have long-term benefit to the society. And moreover, sometimes GLC may also not undertake projects which are deemed as too risky, as it may lead to opposition from voters or employers. In the research methodology that is used in this study, we use the data from 2002 to 2017, a total of 16 years of panel data with approximately 8,000 firm-year observations. The politically connected firms' data is hand-collected, but of course they are based on several resources, such as the ones by Prof. Gomez and Prof. Jamo in 1997, which we then updated. But the paper by Johnson and Meaton in 2003, which we also updated, from annual reports from Bursa Malaysia, and also from the Putrajaya Committee on GLC High Performance website. For the methodology in this paper, we use the GMM method estimation, which is also called as generalized method of moments, due to the endogeneity issue in this area of study. So these are the results. So there are several key results that I would like to highlight out. From the results, what we get is that when we test political connection as a single dummy variable, we see that political connection does not have a role in affecting the firm's risk-taking, which means that generally, political connection does not affect risk-taking. But when we further analyze it by separating political connection into few different types, 4 different types to be exact, we find that different types of connection can affect risk-taking differently. We would like to point out that firms that are connected through board of directors appears to have no significant relationship with risk-taking. But for firms like government-linked companies, it appears that it has a negative relationship with risk-taking. So it means that the presence of government ownership in a firm will decrease the risk-taking propensity of the firms. And this result is actually consistent with all the past literatures in this area, which found a negative relationship between GLCs and risk-taking. And I've seen a paper which uses the data of China, where they also found that state-owned enterprises in China also have a negative relationship with risk-taking, which shows that the results of this study is quite consistent with all the GLCs or SOEs, or you like to call it, that they tend to be perhaps submissive to the government, so that because they need to undertake their projects which have higher social obligations as compared to the higher projects which have high investment returns to the firms. And another thing that we'd like to point out from the result is that we found that all the politically connected firms in this study appears to not have a positive relationship with risk-taking, which means all of them either had negative relationship with risk-taking or had no relationship with risk-taking. So it shows that even with valuable resources such as political connection, where it should provide advantages to firms and whereby it should help firms to increase their level of risk-taking, in fact, it did not. The result of this paper does not show it that it should be the case. In fact, it is the opposite. In the further analysis, we actually further find out whether the role of corporate governance can help to mitigate the effect of political connection or risk-taking or not. And we use three monitoring mechanisms, which is the percentage of independent directors, board size, and also financial leverage, to test whether corporate governance can impact or change the relationship between political connection and risk-taking. And what we found was that in firms where political connection does not impact risk-taking, when corporate governance comes in as an interaction term, it can help to change the result from no effect to a slightly positive effect. But when corporate governance comes in as an interaction effect between GLCs and also risk-taking, it has no significant relationship, which means that perhaps CG mechanisms is not powerful enough to change the negative relationship between GLCs and also risk-taking. In the conclusion, we would just like to wrap up things and also to highlight out the few findings that we get from this study. Firstly, we find that different types of connection affect risk-taking differently, where firms connected through board of directors do not impact risk-taking, but firms that are connected through government-linked companies have a negative relationship with risk-taking. Secondly, generally we find that most firms in Asia are very risk-averse, and the result of this study, I don't know whether to say you can confirm this, but it shows that even with that extra advantage of being politically connected, none of them have higher risk-taking as compared to non-connected firms. Then thirdly is, of course, from the corporate governance mechanism side, where we found that when political forces are not at work, which is in our example, the firms that are politically connected through board of directors, when CG comes in, it could change the relationship between the firm and also risk-taking. But in firms where political forces are at work, where GLCs have negative relationship with risk-taking, we find that when corporate governance mechanism comes in, it is not strong enough or powerful enough to change the negative relationship between GLCs and also risk-taking. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
First, let me thank the PM for this invitation. This Wildin Sian here and Sulaiman Mahbub also here. It brings back a lot of memories about previous conventions of the PM and the early 70s, especially when we have introduced the NEP, and most economists among them, concentrated on the issues of related development issues, strategies, programs, restructuring issues, labor, and so on, and employment, as well as poverty. Now we have come all this way to how many years, 30, 45 years later, to talk basically about governance issues, the impact of participation of the so-called underdeveloped sectors of the economy, whether you define it as race or non-racial, is now have gone through about 45 years or nearly 50 years of the implementation of the NEP and its successor policies. We come to a stage where we are dealing with this big issue about how we allocate resources and ensure there is an equitable distribution of the impact of that allocation and investments. I think I mean, many of you probably were not born at that time, in the 70s. How many are born after the 70s? Can you raise your hands? I just want to get a sense. Yeah, not quite half, let's say 1/3. So there's still institutional and personal memory of what we went through. Malaysia Inc. 1 was introduced in around 81, 80 through maybe 85, if you remember, by Prime Minister Tun Mahathir. And the idea was to get the state sector to cooperate, which has gone already at that time under the ambit of liberalization, the Reaganism and Thatcherism and all that, to try and restructure and liberalize the economy so that the private sector can play a role, because the state sector has gone, even though in the early first 10 years, gone slightly beyond, quite beyond its stated role. I'm a Keynesian, or a post-Keynesian now maybe, and I believe in the mixed economy, and I believe the state and the market have roles to play. Enterprise, private enterprise, and state enterprises are part of the mixed economy. But when the state power overrides many allocation decisions, or because of market failures, intervene in the system, in the economic system of allocations, and therefore there is a place and a role, and that is economics 101 basically. So that's not a problem. The problem and this is quite rightly brought out both by the earlier publication of Jomo and Terence, on maybe associated with his PhD at that time, about business links companies or political link companies. And now in this new data that they have analyzed with much more information, comes at a time when in fact the issues associated with the economic policy of affirmative action and the need to continue to support the Bumiputra community and through its economic growth and so on. And many data has been presented about how the Bumiputra sector has been stuck at about 20%, 21% depending, and over the last 10 years have not moved even beyond that, maybe to 22%, and may have slipped back. The issue has always been ownership and control. And the seminal development, what we call intervention or study by Terence and Jomo, was in fact what we call a call, an important what we call step after the studies by James Putticherry on ownership and control in the economy, which until the NEP and until the late 80s when Tunku Razali was the minister and brought back Sam Darby or Guthrie in the Dawn reign, the control was essentially largely in foreign hands. Now we moved, the non-Bhumi sector have gone up, and we know that those statistics are there, and that that is at the expense of the foreign domination, foreign holdings, and that the Bumiputra sector has risen marginally or quite considerably up to 23%, 22% or whatever. So the issue behind this coming so-called Malaysia Incorporated 2.0, Malaysia Inc. being a copy of the Japanese Inc. in the 70s, which became the inspiration for Malaysia Inc., by Tun Mahathir under the Lucas policy. In Japan itself, where the developmental state plays a role in identifying winners and identifying and promoting sectors through an industrialization process that led to further consolidation of the keiretsus and so on, until Japan reaches its own financial crisis in the early 1990s. And that's where they had to then go overseas and started to invest in Malaysia. And that's part of our high-speed growth of the 1990s up to our own crisis in 98. So, Jomo and I had got a coin. He did it, I don't know who did first. But then Mahathir's policies are of two sets. And therefore, there's a Mark I policy, Mahathir, and there's Mahathir Mark II. Mark I was before the liberalization phase, post-1985 recession, towards the end of the so-called former period of the NEP, the first outline perspective plan, which is 20 years, ending in 1990. And there was a post-NEP hiatus to find what is the new policy for the post-1990 policy. But already science was showing that if we do not reduce the role of the state in promoting the NEP, then foreign investment and therefore foreign savings, investment, resources and so on will not come in. In fact, between 86 and 1889, there was a period of uncertainty where there was a whole wait and see. It is almost like the current situation. So in fact, it is the current situation that you are now having to examine 9.2. Because basically, the argument is that, putting it very simply, from two sources. One is political parties, the other is the beneficiaries of the political patronage in the Bumiputra economic community, which are also collected. In UMNO itself, there's a change in the membership from the earlier period to the present period, where businesses now has dominated the corporate sector. Corporate players have dominated the politics of UMNO. Previously, it was civil servants and the teachers that control the party. So when the party was dominated by the corporate sector, then obviously the whole cozy relationship between the state and political players become very important and becomes critical. And state capture is the order of the day since the crisis of 1998. Meaning in this case that using the power of patronage, the power of decision-making over resources, whether federal or state, and also the difference between Peninsula and East Malaysia, the allocations are a function of who is in power and who controls the executive. And Terence and partners' findings show that basically in the latest era, past 10 years under the Najib administration, the executive itself has taken over the function. By executive, I mean the politicians, not the civil servants. The civil servants under the Tun Razak regime played a very, what we call, regulatory role plus arbiter of allocations from the tax revenues of the federal government, but driven by certain rules of financial procedure, a very strong civil service, technically still very competent. But when Mahathir came in, he introduced the need to supplement the role of the civil service with advice and inputs from the public sector, from the private sector. And that's where the first Malaysia Inc. came into the picture. And it later evolved and became stronger and stronger. Malaysian Business Council, and all the other GACs and so on came into the picture. So you got a mess. And even the diagrams that is shown by Terence shows the mess we are all in. Now, how to unravel this mess is a critical challenge to this government now. And they have already made the first move. Then you must downsize. You have to downsize this so-called what shall we call this? This is a third sector actually. There's government, there's business, and there's the third sector, which is NGOs. But in fact, when we talk about the GLCs, look at the mass and the control of the stock market and the entire economy by these GLCs and GLICs, you're talking about another sector, the fourth sector. You want to call it the fourth sector? It is so crucial to the way we move forward. But our problem, the complexity that is ours, is because politics has come into play. And therefore you get a whole mess of patronage, wastage, failure, corporate failures, a new labor aristocracy amongst the GLC managers and supervisors. Even the small, nascent Bumiputra entrepreneurs are always only getting the crumbs. And therefore arose a conflict between GLCs and the small businesses. Again, the small business in our peculiar setup is also racially divided. There's discrimination, racial discrimination, that is proven in the labor market, both in the private labor market and in the public sector market as well. Discrimination is not a function of what sector. Both Malay-dominated public sector, Chinese-dominated private sector practice unfair trade practices, monopolies, as well as discrimination. I will in 1 minute. So basically, my question is, Malaysia Incorporated 2.0 is being administered by Mahathir Mark II, but in the third version, which is now under his own premiership, which version will come out, Mark I or Mark II? And the way this is going to be strategized or played out, the danger is only that what happened in the 1998 or late 90s in the Mark II version might be extended. If it goes back to Mark I, where principles of rules of governance, clarity, transparency, and so on are dominant, and the rule of law, or rather rules, management by rules and not by political patronage or considerations, that is the nature of the dilemma going forward. And the Bumiputra issue is going to be here for another 10 years at the minimum. Thank you.
I'm very conscious of the time we have. I think I'm going to open the discussion to the House. Before I do so, I want to make 1 or 2 or 3 comments which will be useful in our discussion. One, parents talk about this monster of GLCs and related inequality and so on. And he said that nobody dares to close them down. I remember, you see, we had 3 crises eventually, the 90s and the 2000s. Actually, in the mid-80s, we had a serious crisis. And it was during that time that cabinet under Malaysia took a decision to close down our jails. He took a decision, especially the state SCDCs. As a result, if you look at the history and performance of these SCDCs, there was a moment of love. They didn't close them down, they just made them come up. And now he has come up. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is this monstrous rise of GLCs. In most cases are related to the end. In fact, a lot of them are set up in the day. Most of them, not all. Third, on the problem of risk. Conventional wisdom, to me, is that when you have a GLC, you either have a patron in government or you have government money. And therefore, when you don't have your own money at stake, you take more risk. So the conventional wisdom is, if you run a GLC, you should take more risk. I don't like it. Right? But the results say the complete opposite, which baffles me. I think has to do with, I read your paper, I think maybe a lot has to do with specification of your model. Has to do with, in fact, many of the results were statistically non-significant. So you can't say anything about the conclusion. But it's an interesting exercise, and it should be pursued further. Okay, now I'm going to open the discussion to the House. In order that we will be able to get as many questions as possible, why don't I try to get in 4 or 5 questions first, and then get the time to answer them once, because we have roughly only 15 minutes. Questions, please. Very brief, indicate who you are, where you come from, and ask the question. When you want to comment, very brief comment. You are also baffled.
Good afternoon. I'm Rasmi from Malaysian Institute of Accountants. I'm very interested in the charts that Professor Terence shared just now. We have been looking at various entities. Of course, we look at federal government entities as well as state government entities. And I think the peculiar things about these structures are, for example, under the federal government, for example, they have statutory bodies. Malaysian Institute of Accountants, we are a statutory body and we report to the Ministry of Finance. And basically, Ministry of Finance is our regulator. And then you also see those companies who are governed by the Suruhanjaya Syarikat Malaysia, and under Suruhanjaya Syarikat Malaysia, you also have a few types of companies. Yeah, so I think we all know the issue here is what you should do about all this, right? And I think that's why I point out the point about who is regulating all these entities, and therefore the regulators of these entities, they need to think about how should we deal with all these issues. Yes, we can have the discussion, but again, who will be the one who need to implement whatever that we discuss here would be one of the very important stakeholder, I think, would be the relevant regulator.
Ansri, good afternoon to everyone. Ravindran Sage, Sri Capital. Yeah. You asked can we give a comment, and you said you were baffled by this explanation, which is counterintuitive. I worked in 2 GLCs in the past, but one of the things I noticed is why I would propose one possibility why risk-taking is lower in a GLC. Honestly, if you look at some of the GLC salaries, it's exceptionally high. The last thing I would want to do is take risk and lose my job. Yeah? That's probably something you can discuss, but this is my theory.
I'd like to start by commenting also on the speakers who came after me. First, the definition of politically connected companies. I was surprised that in Ms. Wong's paper that there was no mention of any company. Not one company name was mentioned. Now, I'm particularly keen on this because my PhD was on politically connected companies. And the point I would like to make is this, that when there has been a change of premiership, there has also been a change of what we classify as politically connected companies. It's not something which, if Mahathir created some well-connected people, they have sustained themselves through time. That's not true. And some of these politically connected companies who were created, say, by Mahathir would have encountered problems, say, under Najib's time. And what happened to the people who were created by Abdullah? And where are they today? So with every regime change, we have seen a change of politically connected companies. My argument would be is that we have seen a diminishing in the size of politically connected companies because of the rise of the GLCs. In particular, the executive arm of government, when he realized that he was sitting on a huge gold mine, and I showed you the scale and scope of GLCs, this was something they now had direct control over. They did not need to deal with business people. And this is particularly true, I would argue, in the case of Najib. Najib initially had talked about, when he came to power, small government and privatization. He instructed Pamandu to do it. If you read Pamandu's first report, there's a lot of discussion on privatization. And then if you read the second report, privatization is reduced to a footnote. No more privatization. Why? Because they realize now they have significant control over the corporate sector, which they can use for their own vested interests. And you saw the consequences of that in the scandals, which then emanated from Najib's administration. 1MDB is only one of them. We have seen the case of LT Edge and LTT, and of course, KWAP, now the center of discussion in the court cases. Now, that's on the first point. Who exactly do we mean when we talk about politically connected companies? And what exactly is this relationship with GLCs? Would be interesting to see, because I think there's a disconnect here between the two. They run separately. Najib created his own well-connected companies too. I can name some of them. Pavilion, for example, is one example. George Kent is another example of a company which emerged under Najib. So how do they function, and what is their relationship with GLCs? And I think this is linked to the issue of risk-taking, and how we then talk about risk-taking by these companies. What risk is there for these politically well-connected companies when all the rents are liberally being given to them? Look at George Kent. George Kent makes pipes, and now they're building an LRT, which basically is subcontracting to other people to do it for them. And what about Malton Group, Desmond Lim, Pavilion? Pavilion now was the order of the day under Najib. So there are all these issues I felt which should go into discussing what is the state of play when we talk about politically connected companies and GLCs. I say that because today we have a Malaysia Baru. And this Malaysia Baru is supposed to be an open, transparent government, which is also supposed to deal with these politically connected companies, put a stop to that, and revamp the GLCs. I don't think either is happening. I do believe a new set of politically connected companies are emerging. And as far as the GLCs are concerned, I come back to the point, the question was raised, the statutory bodies, the regulatory role they play, who exactly should be taking charge of this. These are the issues which we put to the CEP when we met them. Different institutions play different roles. We have to be very clear what these roles are for these different institutions. What exactly is the role of the GLICs, which the government has classified, and even among the GLCs there are differences. What is the role of Khazanah? And we didn't have a debate about Khazanah because Mahathir came to power and said he redefined Khazanah's role. Khazanah, according to him, now was supposed to promote Bumiputra enterprises. That was not Khazanah's role. When did this become Khazanah's role? Khazanah was supposed to play the role of a sovereign wealth fund, a risk taker, promoting new industries. That was their role. So you see the shifting, and who dictates what now is the role of Khazanah. To my mind, PNB was primarily responsible for promoting the rise of Bumiputra capital. Who decided that that Khazanah now should play the role of promoting Bumiputra enterprises? And this is linked to the point that Kamal raised. What we have, I'm happy he brought it up, because what we have to deal with, which is at the center of this, and which is holding us back from moving forward, is the Bumiputra issue. The Bumiputra issue is this. When the Pakatan was in opposition, they said no more race-based policies. It's explicit. When they came to power, there was a shift. They even had, in September, just a few months after coming to power, a Bumiputra Economic Congress. And that was supposed to be an open door discussion, which became a closed door discussion. And then from there emanated discussions of the need to maintain the Bumiputra policy. And then from there came the role of the GLC. If you read the midterm review, which you all got a copy of, the midterm review of the 11th Malaysia Plan is there in front of you. It is explicit that the GLCs play the role of promoting Bumiputra enterprises. This was something Najib decided under the 11th Malaysia Plan. We thought that there will be a revamp of this after the new government came to power, because they had explicitly stated we cannot merge the two anymore. It didn't happen. In fact, they continued the same policies. Now, this is the debate that we've been telling the politicians that we need to have. we have to be clear what the institutions are, what their roles are, and be explicit as to if we have GLCs, what exactly do these GLCs do? This is different from the statutory bodies. This is different from the Sovereign Wealth Fund. This is different from the investment bodies like PNB and ETF. And what, I'll just finish. And what of the Bumiputra policy? What of the Bumiputra policy? Why is there no debate on this? Kamal ended by saying it's going to be here for some time. Where is the debate? Who decided that this should be the debate? Now, all these are well interconnected. And unless there's going to be political will to reform this, to change this, it's going to happen. And the reason why there's not going to be any reform or change of this, because at the moment, there's a serious political contestation going on among elites in power today. And that's what's holding back the reforms that we need to have.
Thank you for the comments on my paper, especially to Tan Sri Dr. Lim Sian, a member of the floor, and also by Professor Dr. Edmund Terence comments. There are a few things that I would like to clarify. Regarding the issue of no company's name being mentioned here is because it's academic paper, so our results is actually more of a, we like to explain our results in an average way, as in like, no, we should not mention any names because it's not a case study academic paper, whereas it's more of our average result on all the politically connected firms in Malaysia. We also do not wish to pinpoint any companies in Malaysia. And also regarding the issue of when some Prime Minister change, how about the data of politically connected firms in our study? So because we are doing a panel data, which means that we have firm year observations. So for example, for like those firms that are related to Prime Minister Badawi, so when he is in power, because we are using dummy variable to categorize our politically connected firms, so when he is in power, we will change the dummy variable from 0 to 1. When he is not in power, we will change it from 1 to 0, and also it's similar for the other two prime ministers. And regarding the comments by a member of the floor and also other panelists here, we would like to take into account and address all our shortcomings of our paper in a more modified version. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, Kamal, you have the last. I wanted to make a comment on Wong's paper just now on politically connected business and on the results of her negative findings or findings about negative relationship between political power and risk-taking behavior of entrepreneurship and business. I think the counterintuitive results you obtain, as I think Tan Sri Lin said also, could be your classification of politically connected companies, which you may kind of fine-tune. When this matter was brought up by Terence at one discussion I had with him on this second study, I did say that politically connected must be defined not just by the person who is on the board, but the way in which that person on the board is related to relatives and friends and so on. And for instance, therefore, patronage becomes, and the extension, by extension of patronage to rent-seeking behavior, has to do with the family relationships of those who are on the board. NFC is an example of how such thing actually can happen and distort the issue. But I want to add another maybe possible factor, and maybe this is what Wong can look into, and the role of moral hazard in terms of this framework of moral hazard, Merle's framework, to try and to unravel the connection between politics and business in enterprises. There might be some where it's related to risk-taking behavior. Since and it has to do with ownership and control. There is control, and the political control is the real driver of GLCs, GLICs, especially by way of appointments to the board of directors. But ownership is supposed to be the government. And to answer your question that Gomez Clarence raised, that who decides that these GLCs will be the patron of Bhumiputra policy or whatever, either under Mahathir in the first instance, Pala after that, and now Najib, and now back to Mahathir. It is politics that decides. Political power. Who holds political power decides what is the role of these GLCs and GLICs. But under the original concept of GLCs and such pseudo-market statutory bodies is the role of the trust economy, that these institutions, enterprises, semi-government enterprises, whatever, are supposed to hold the value added from GLC activities, whatever federal or state level, basically in trust for the Bhumiputra community, who does not have the financial wherewithal in order to invest and therefore claim ownership, except by dint of government suzerainty. So that scenario value of economic wealth creation by GLCs, which is being held in trust by the government or the powers that be holding the government power on behalf of the rest, meaning on behalf of the small and medium scale and the ordinary folks, the rakyat, is the key. Of course, the tax system plays part of that role, and through fiscal policy there is redistribution of that value added. But that surplus is actually still the problem of ownership becomes a problem. So when Tegi suggested, when that time we were with Pala, then the Bhumiputra issue of reaching 30% has been overachieved. He calculated that the Bhumiputra sector has already achieved 45%. And we, Ismail Saleh, the economist, lead economist, Zana Aznam, myself, we agreed. We said, okay, let's accept that principle and therefore go on beyond the NEP-based policies towards more financial liberalization, more enterprise development, promotion of the private sector and so on, and even foreign investment. But the problem is that the ownership was arbitrarily defined, meaning that the total ownership of government companies should by right be owned by all Malaysians. But in order to allocate it among the races, then Tegi suggested that we go by way of representation of population. Well, okay, we go by that ratio. And that's how you get to 45% Bhumiputra ownership. And therefore, no more NEP. We were willing to declare that formally. Of course, there are other players, other kitchen cabinet members who think differently. And the political dimension was the key, the power to decide who benefits from what allocation of the government finances. And that's why the Bhumiputra question will remain there for a while until you are able to secure the ownership portion, not control. Control was already there, although distorted by all kinds of moral hazard, unprofessional conduct, corruption, kleptocracy, and all that, and wastage, incompetence on the part of civil servants to run businesses. That's part of the problem. But the Bhumiputra question is a political question. And so long as that issue is on the table, politically, it's going to be a messy exercise to restructure.
Thank you very much. There you are, ladies and gentlemen. Very interesting session. I wish we had more time, but all good things must come to an end. I want to invite you to join me to thank our three professionals here with me. What a very good.
Thank you very much, the panel speakers, for such a thought-provoking session. I think some of us are baffled, but I hope after the session this afternoon we'll be less baffled. Okay, all right, now, can the speakers stay on stage? Because we have a token appreciation which will be given by Yang Berhormat Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Lee Si Yan.